Oh yeah, I said it. Happy Columbus Day. Hi, thanks for watching. So today I want to talk about Columbus Day and its decline in the past several years in the United States, about celebrating it. A lot of cities have decided they don't want to celebrate it anymore, and I want to talk about that. One of the things to think about is when we celebrate a person, we're celebrating their achievement. We're not celebrating their failures. We're not celebrating the consequences of what they did. We're celebrating the achievement of what they did. And I think it's really unfair to lump everything in, all the consequences of Columbus, and put them all on his shoulders. Judging the past through the lens of today, it's really culturally biased. And it's not a good thing. It's called presentism. That's judging people in the past, judging things in the past by the morals of today. And it's just foolish. I'll give you a couple examples. First of which, Eddie Murphy. In my opinion, one of the funniest human beings in the history of this planet. He is hilarious. I remember when Delirious came out in 1983. I listened to that album over and over again. It was the funniest thing I've ever heard. And I went back and listened to it. The first joke, right off the bat, is terribly homophobic. It's horrible. And there are so many toxic jokes in that special that it would never fly today. So much of what he says would be so politically incorrect. He would be boycotted. He would be forced to apologize. He would be kicked off Twitter. People would protest his concerts. But it's 2018. This was 1983. This was 35 years ago. You know, I looked at the New York Times review for this album. They didn't seem to have a problem with the homophobia in it. It was a different time. That's not to excuse it, but we shouldn't be judging Eddie Murphy's comedy from 1983 by today's standards. That's silly. You know, he went on to then record Raw, which was the biggest comedy concert album ever. And you wouldn't be allowed to do that. You wouldn't get funding for a film if you put out this horribly toxic, homophobic album. Like, no one would fund your next project, but they did that. But this was the 80s. This wasn't 2018. Another example, Breakfast at Tiffany's. This is a favorite of many people. Fantastic film from 1961. And you have Mickey Rooney with the portrayal of Mr. Yunioshi, living upstairs, the Japanese guy, and he has these big buck teeth, and he speaks with a terrible, terrible accent, right? At the time, that was really funny. Now you look back on it, and it's horribly racist. I looked at the review from 1961 in the New York Times. They talked about his portrayal of Mr. Yunioshi as being broadly exotic. They didn't say it was racist, because at the time, people didn't see it that way. Mickey Rooney was asked about it about 10 years ago, that people had a problem with it. And he said, you know, for 40 years, I've been praised for that role. He said people of all different walks, Chinese people, Asian people, all have told me how funny that role was. He seemed really hurt, and he said, if I had known that this would offend people, I never would have made it. But this was 1961, and that's looking at through the lens of the current century. It's a different time. But if we really want to go back, we can go back to Jesus 2,000 years ago. He had a group around him, his disciples, and he was teaching them. And they were all men. There were women that were also around him at the time, but he didn't allow them to be disciples. He only allowed the men to be disciples. Through today's lens, some people might consider that to be misogynistic. They would think that Jesus is part of the patriarchy. It's even possible that the Southern Poverty Law Center would put him as the leader of a hate group because he discriminates against women. But that would be looking at it through the lens of today. That's presentism. And I think that that's really naive and foolish. You know, we don't do this when we're judging fashion, do we? If you were to look back at my picture from middle school, you'd think my hairstyle and the clothes that I wore were ridiculous. But then if you compared them to every other boy in my class, you would understand. I was just wearing what everybody else was wearing at the time. And we accept that in fashion. We should accept that with all things. It only makes sense. In the future, we don't really know what people are going to have a problem with about today. We don't know. Things have really changed. Things have changed so much in my own lifetime. You know, when I was in high school, I didn't have a single friend that was out as being gay. But in college, I had many friends that came out as gay. It was a different time back then as to when people felt comfortable announcing their sexuality. Now, kids in middle school can announce that they're trans or gay, and nobody seems to have a real issue with it. It's not a big deal anymore. This has been a big change in my own life. And so how are we going to judge someone of what they did over 500 years ago? You may think you understand what things were like back then, but you don't. You weren't there. You haven't studied it. You haven't read a book on it. You don't know. Now, I believe in the future, this is just a guess, that they are going to look back on us today in 2018 and are going to be very critical about how much we supported factory farming. I really believe that. It's possible that they will not have any holidays to celebrate anyone that ate beef. You think I'm kidding, but that's possible. You know, maybe in the future we'll get rid of Martin Luther King Day because he ate beef. We don't know what is going to be acceptable in the future. And we don't know of the things that we're doing today that's totally acceptable that's not going to be acceptable in the future. Before Columbus, people lived where they had lived for tens of thousands of years. After Columbus, people could live anywhere on the planet. The world got a whole lot smaller, and it was a big shift. It was one of the most important events in the history of humankind. I think reflecting on that once a year is not a bad thing, and that's why today I'm going to think about Columbus on Columbus Day. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Peace. Help me reach my goal of 1 million of 2,000 subscribers by clicking the like button and subscribing. Thanks.